This is a Fox News Alert. I'm Brett Baer in Washington. We are counting down the hours to midnight Eastern, and the funding, well, running dry for the Homeland Security Department. That means right now we're engaged in some serious horse trading on Capitol Hill. What started as a Republican stand to the president's executive actions on immigration has transitioned now to Democrats holding their ranks together and forcing House Republican leaders to scramble. One attempt to temporarily fund the agency has already failed tonight. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel is here with the very latest and where we are at this second. Hi, Mike.
Well, Brett, good evening. With 52 Republicans voting against a 3-week extension of Homeland Security funding, the measure failed 224 to 203 a short time ago. Now House leadership is scrambling for Plan B. One idea I've heard is a 7-day, literally 1-week extension of Homeland Security money. Another, perhaps more likely scenario is the House taking up a Senate-passed funding extension which would run through September with the help of Democrats and national security Republicans.
Members are advised that additional votes are now possible later this evening and maybe this weekend.
By a 228 to 191 vote, lawmakers also voted for the House and Senate to go to conference and work on a long-term funding deal. The House Democratic leader ripped the GOP for wanting to go that route.
This is really amateur hour to the nth degree.
The Senate passed a different plan, funding DHS through September 30th by a vote of 68 to 31. A bill from Maine Republican Susan Collins to defund the president's 2014 immigration plan was backed by Democrats Donnelly, McCaskill, Manchin, and Heitkamp, but fell short of the 60-vote threshold.
Common sense legislation that would protect our democracy from the egregious example of executive overreach we saw in November. It actually, in my view, deserves broad support.
A Senate Democrat who served 3 tours as a naval flight officer during the Vietnam War warned against putting the nation's security on autopilot with a short-term extension.
Autopilot works fine some of the time. Works fine some of the time. Unless you run into weather. Unless you run into a typhoon, unless you run into turbulence, unless you run into incoming fire.
With Democrats overwhelmingly rejecting the 3-week extension, Republican leadership needed to keep their ranks tight, needed to keep their support strong. Now they'll likely need to appeal to Democrats to try to get something across the finish line and avoid a partial government shutdown. Brett?
So just to be clear, the Senate has passed a clean bill. So far, there's no indication that House leaders are bringing that up, even with Democratic support.
Well, that would be wildly unpopular with a lot of conservatives who still want to fight the president on immigration, and they don't like that Leader McConnell said, okay, let's go for a bipartisan deal and pass a funding extension through September. And so there are challenges to that. That would upset a lot of conservatives within the House ranks, and they've been fighting that tooth and nail, Brett.
All right, we'll see where that goes. Thanks, Mike.
Sure.
We'll head back for breaking details. We're going to bring in our panel, actually, a little earlier. Syndicated columnist George Will, Kirsten Powers, USA Today columnist, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. This has been the MO lately, George, how we go from crisis to crisis with this funding. What do you think happens here and the bind that they're in temporarily funding this?
It's hard to say because it's hard to see the goal they're trying to reach, the conservatives who insist on trying to lasso the president with this power of the purse. They're mad at the president, and rightly so, because he's violating the separation of powers by taking lawmaking into his own hands. On the other hand, they ought to acknowledge the separation of powers that they're defending, which makes it impossible for them to move forward as long as they can't get a bill that both houses agree on. And the Democrats are simply not going to agree on anything that the House sends them that is satisfactory to the conservatives.
I mean, that's important to point out, Kirsten, is that this 3-week extension was voted against. Democrats voted no, largely, and some conservatives left as well. And they want to fund it through September.
Mm-hmm. Well, this just, of course, is becoming this overly familiar experience, and I don't think the Republicans have gotten the message just yet that this doesn't really work for them. And so it's interesting to watch them do it again with something dealing with security, which makes it even stranger, considering what's going on in the world right now today. Trying to essentially attach something to a DHS funding bill, I just think is bad politics.
This is heading into the weekend. They think they have a little wiggle room here, We've pointed out that 85% of the DHS employees show up anyway if the funding thing doesn't get approved by midnight, but still it is a deadline.
And it's a disaster. I mean, if you cannot execute a surrender, well, then you're in real trouble. And if you can't execute a surrender when you control both houses, you really ought to think of a different line of work. The Republicans lost on this. There was a way out. It would have been a radical way, and that would have been to abolish the filibuster, and to pass it in the Senate, and to pass it in the House. That would have worked. Nobody wanted to go radical. That's okay. But if you don't, you can't get anything through because the Democrats would stop it in the Senate. If it stopped in the Senate, it's futile to attempt to do it in the House because it will go nowhere. So at this point, if you're not going to go radical in the Senate, you throw in the towel, you don't prolong the agony, and you fight somewhere else on the firmer ground. But to go on with this again and again, the Democrats have already won the PR campaign. Everybody will blame whatever happens on the Republicans. They are not going to pass anything that will restrain the president on immigration. So give it up and move on.
Now, there's a one-week alternative for funding here now that is being discussed that possibly they're considering. The bottom line here, though, is are the leaders in the House, if they have to pass a clean bill, George, threatened with their leadership in their own conservative caucus should they have to pass with Democratic votes?
Well, there are two people embarrassed by this. One is Speaker Boehner. And there may just come a time when he thinks that herding cats is just not worth the trouble. The other person is Congressman Scalise from Louisiana, who was brought into the leadership because he has strong Tea Party connections, and they said he would be able to bring the conservatives along with him. He didn't do it today.
Majority Whip Scalise, by the way, is going to be on Fox News Sunday. I'm sure they'll have a lot to talk about. We will follow this and bring the panel back in just a bit. Up next, Jeb Bush tries to court conservatives up and down the East Coast while other conservatives openly criticize him at the same event. Plus, later, a huge story that is just starting to unfold about Iran, Osama bin Laden, and al-Qaeda. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 2 in St. Louis with a grisly murder mystery in the Ozarks. Police say a man who may have been unhinged by the death of his ailing mother went on a house-to-house shooting rampage, killing 7 people before taking his own life. Fox 11 in Los Angeles and the death of the star of Star Trek's show, Mr. Spock. Leonard Nimoy, who portrayed the iconic half-Vulcan, half-human first officer of the USS Enterprise, died today of obstructive pulmonary disease. He was 83. And this is a live look at Atlanta from Fox 5. I think that's Atlanta. Big story there tonight. Someone stole a $250,000 stock car from a hotel parking lot not far from the Atlanta Motor Speedway. NASCAR veteran Travis Qualpil was still looking for his ride, but since he missed today's inspection, he will not run in Sunday's Sprint Cup event. That mystery is still ongoing. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. A lot of breaking news tonight. We'll be right back.